All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you to everybody at InterAccess for putting this together, in particular Galen for reaching out to me. It's really lovely to be here. I'm going to end up talking eventually about this book here. First, though, I wanted to talk less about writing and more about translation. So most of the projects that I'm working on, I'm working through the idea of translation in kind of specific ways. So I wanted to start with a quote here from Benjamin. It comes from an essay called The Task of the Translator. He argues then that the task of the translator consists in finding that intended effect upon the language into which they are translating, which produces in it the echo of the original. I like that idea, the echo. In the same way, a translation, instead of resembling the meaning of the original, must lovingly and in detail incorporate the original's mode of signification, thus making both the original and the translation recognizable as fragments of a greater language, just as fragments are part of a vessel. And this is my favorite part. A real translation is transparent. It doesn't cover the original, does not black its light, but allows the pure language, as though reinforced by its own medium, to shine upon the original all the more fully. So, I like this idea of translation. He's working through it in this essay. Translation, in terms of pure fidelity, is impossible. We're never going to get one-to-one matching. So he's saying then the act of translation has to be something else entirely. So he's talking about like a translation echoes the original, it gestures towards it. But the image that I like at the bottom here makes me think of a set of layers, and sets of layers of language, and you're kind of looking down through it. And the translation is porous, and you can look down, it doesn't black out the original, but rather the original is coming up as you look down through it. And it's this kind of multitudinous layering of language that's going on. So in this way, I'm working with Marjorie Perloff's writings on conceptual writing, in particular the book Original Genius, where she talks about conceptual writing being translational, writing in multiple languages to take from one language into another. But for me, specifically, this also means digital and human language translations, including code and markup. So for me, when I'm talking about translation in my projects, I'm working through the kind of many multiple layers of language and language acts that are going on. I'm talking more about translation in an intersemiotic way, so I'll talk about what that means. And then cooperating with my machine co-authors as a way of like outsourcing chance, as a way of getting outside of kind of human rationality. So beginning with the language, every time we engage with a piece of hardware, we are engaging with just this strata of language. It goes up and down, right? At the very base level, computers talk to each other through electronic pulses. It has nothing to do with us or human language. So they're talking to each other with just on-off pulses back and forth. And then we start getting a language that maybe we can read, sort of. Machine language, very low language. Assembly language, a little bit higher. You have the operating system above that. Then you have the software that's plugging into the operating system, like say a web browser. And then within the web browser, you go to a web page. There might be some scripts running, some small programs running. Within that, you then have markup, like your HTML that's controlling how the thing looks. And then even within that, then you get the human language. And you might even have multiple human languages on the same web page. So when we write poetry, I would say even when we just write on a laptop, any computer, we're engaging with this sort of multiple layer of languages at once. And in particular, when we're working through translation, we're navigating these layers of language at all times. So this multilingual sort of act of translation, and in particular, this idea of intersemiotic translation. So this comes from Roman Jakobson's essay, really famous essay on linguistic aspects of translation. He lays out three types of translation. The first two are closer to what we know, like just literal translation. But the third one, he says, is wherein there is an interpretation of verbal signs by means of signs of nonverbal systems. And Mundes, a linguist, expands on this. A change in medium, such as the translation that occurs when a composer puts words to music, or more notably when the musical sound replaces the verbal code. So for me, an even easier example is when you have a book and they translate it into a movie. Like you're moving from different mediums and different kind of meaning systems from one to the other. It's very different than, say, translating from English to French. Okay. So we're working with all these layers of language. We're working in sort of an intersemiotic act of translation. And then for me, I'm using and participating, cooperating with my machine co-authors as a way of also trying to get outside of my own kind of human mind and generate things that surprise me, generate things that are outside of my control. And machines are actually quite good at this. Like, you can tell it to do random things, and it's good at that. So for me, this comes from a tradition of kind of Oulipo writers, automatic writers, surrealists that were also just doing automatic writing, things like that, as a way of getting out of their minds. In particular, as you can tell from the book, I'm really focused on Marcel Duchamp, and he talks specifically about chance. And he says the duty of chance is to express what is unique and indeterminate about us beyond the rational. And so Calvin Tompkins responds, in your mind, chance is a rational expression of avoiding the control of your mind. And he says, absolutely. So participating in all our multiple sort of languages at once to enact these intersemiotic translations, and then kind of allowing the machine co-authors to take on this idea of variability and chance as a way of producing things, again, that I don't always have a lot of control over. So I'm going to focus mostly on the chess part, but I thought I would talk about these two other works very quickly. First one is lost sets. So what this does very simply is it translates poems into sculptures, and then we 3D print them. The biggest we get them is about 6-inch cubes. They're very beautiful. What ends up happening is Jordan Scott and I, he's a poet, we co-wrote some poems together. I wrote a little Python script that translates them into numbers. Those numbers are joined up into coordinates of 3. That gives you an x, a y, and a z coordinate. And then those coordinates carve out of a cube. I'm working on this project right now. You can see a little bit of it here called OO. Working with the Google Translates camera function. I don't know if people have played around with that. It's borderline voodoo. It's magic, right? Like, you point it at a thing and it translates it in real time. So what I've done is I've taken a specific day in the Canadian Hansard, the day that O Canada was adopted officially as our national anthem, and I'm putting it through this Google Translate sort of thing and collecting up this whole day. It's about 40 pages. Right now, I'm still working on it, still thinking through, but right now it's kind of a photography project. It's a concrete poetry project, but for me it's important because the Canadian Hansard was one of the first Rosetta Stones for computer translation. That when IBM was training its computers how to translate, they used the Canadian parliamentary records because Canada's bilingual and the translations were exactly perfect. So working in this and then trying to work through exactly what O Canada and means in terms of identity and who gets to speak and what sort of languages, again, I'm still working through. But for now, I'll talk a little bit about the chess part, and in particular, irresponsible. Okay, so the chess part really simply translates chess games into poems. So you play a game of chess, or you find an older game of chess, and then Jody Miller and I have created an app that I'm not going to walk you through the flowchart here, it is online, that takes it from algebraic notation in chess into games. I think it's more useful though to start with my main inspiration. So this is a piece, Marcel Duchamp, Reunion, 1968, so about a year before his death. Took place at my home university, Ryerson. You can see Marcel here. This is John Cage, famous American composer. They played a game of chess, and they had designed a board, you can sort of see it here, that when you moved a piece, it signals as sound. And so the game, as it was played, was essentially translated into kind of a symphony. Duchamp, very, very good chess player. So he took one of his knights away and still beat Cage in about 25 minutes. He was an exceptional chess player. People think he gave up his art for chess. He didn't, but he did play chess like fairly regularly for the rest of his life. He was on the French Olympiad team, so he was one of the best 5 players in France for a while. He was a world-class correspondence player. So he demolished Cage, and then Teeny, Marcel's wife, came in and they played. Their game took about 3 hours, I think, and then Marcel started getting sleepy. So but this sort of piece for me is really, really essential to what I was thinking through, just in basic terms of taking a chess game and translating it into something. The fact that it happened here in Toronto is amazing. Okay, so I'll walk a little bit more through it. So takes the algebraic notation from a chess game, translates it into a poem. The poems are 12 source poems. So what I did is I wrote 12 poems, 6 for the white pieces, 6 for the black. So each piece gets a poem. and then each poem is 64 words. So when a piece moves to a square, it triggers a word. And then we're talking about chance. What ends up happening is, because the first time through in the beta, it just turned out word soup. So we decided we needed to actually make these a little bit more grammatical. So what ends up happening is I built a few language templates, like adjective, noun, conjunction, adjective, noun. And then we expanded the language pool of each poem, and what the computer does is it chooses a random template and then compiles it as we go. So, we'll do the demo. Where's the, there it is. Okay, so the site is kind of made up of two parts. We'll do the translator first. So here you can sort of see, you can put in any chess game in translation, in PGN format. This default game is Deep Blue versus Garry Kasparov. So this is the first game in which a computer beat a world-class chess player. Kasparov, considered one of the best chess players of all time, if not the best. Very famously, he talks about this game as having a human move that just spooked him. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know how to understand it. It came out later that the programmers, it might have been a bug, that basically when the computer freaks out, it just chooses a random move. And so that might have been it, but again, like the computer's actually operating at such a level that you can't trace back to its choices. So you can see here, when we hit Poetify, it translates into poems. Let's read the black poem. Blazing center outside, diagonal subtitle, and mechanically winks bound half. Opponent clogs towards black, and the forever greasily materializes strand. The whale below king ventures a globe work. Any drug upon absolution mimics a noise. So strange, weird sort of things are happening out of it. But again, like, I really find lovely little moments. Like this stanza here is great. I don't know what's going to happen when I click that button, so I'm glad that worked out. The poem was nice. You can also play, so what Jody and I did is we strapped the machine to a chess AI. So you can play against a chess AI and then have the games translated in real time. I'm not going to play very much chess in front of you because that embarrasses me. But I just wanted to do this as a way of kind of showing you what ends up happening. Sometimes it does strange things. Like, we're supposed to, when you castle, double the word. Anyway, we can move through that. So, anyway, you can play in real time. What I like about this, though, is that it requires two people, and that I have nothing to do with this poem, right? Like, this is completely the machine's poem. And this, if you want to call it, this would be my poem here. Here we go. Sorry, I'm not used to this double screen. Okay. So then, thinking through this project, I sort of talked about three main questions. Why chess? Why computers? Why poetry? So, to begin with, chess has a really long history in art, in poetry, as it is. In particular, you know, Duchamp was writing and playing and painting about chess. This is his chess players here, I think 1911. There's a long, long history of it being used as a conceptualization of war, of intelligence, of madness, of interiority, of cities. Like, it's just a really rich metaphor that's been employed in a lot of different ways. I think part of this is because each game is a narrative. It has a beginning, it has an end, it has a middle game. In fact, that's what's named in chess, right? And despite this narrative, we still have this idea of play and rules and constraint, which I also really like, that the pieces can only move as the rules intend. There are certain pieces that can't move in certain ways. There's certain pieces that must move in certain ways. But that at all times it's interdependent, that you can't make a move without a response. And that everything is sort of this symbiotic process when you're playing a game of chess. So I wanted to combine chess with computers. Now again, chess actually has a long history with computers as well. You can see here, this is the Turk. This is probably the first chess automaton. It pretended to be a little, like a little robot. You play it. Napoleon, actually, Ben Franklin, like this thing toured all around the world, but there's actually a little guy hidden in there moving it around. But a long, long history of chess automatons. Alan Turing, one of the first originators of digital computing, was obsessed with getting a computer to play a good game of chess. That was always his quote. And for a long time, it's been the litmus test of whether a computer is intelligent. Now, we're at the point where computers, just by pure brute force, are better chess players than humans. It's not even close. That said, you have to build a computer that only knows how to play chess, and then it can be better. It can't make you toast or anything. But still, pretty good, pretty good. I already talked about Deep Blue. To me, another interesting game, maybe even more interesting, was a game, 1999, Kasparov versus the World, where Kasparov played white and the World was crowdsourced by the internet. The moves were crowdsourced by the internet. And so for me, that actually adds in another layer of network technologies that I think is really, really interesting. And as I'm kind of like overlapping computers and chess, I'm also thinking through my own relationship with my computer co-species, and increasingly more ubiquitous, and our relationship with them becomes increasingly more symbiotic. And then lastly, why poetry? So for a lot of the same reasons that I like chess, this is a screenshot from Alice in Wonderland, the chess game that goes on. For one, I see a lot of overlap between chess and poetry. I mean, there's this idea of the infinity of language, but also the repetition within that infinity of language. I think there's 10 to the power of 14 possible chess games, like just a massive amount of chess games. But there's also like impossible games. So for example, the pawns can't move backwards. So when we're playing these poems, you'll never get these words triggered. There's rare games, right? Like a king very rarely makes it up here. So those poems are actually quite rare. And in fact, like when we started translating the Duchamp chess games, like despite this massive sort of infinite amount of moves, the poems actually become repetitive because he plays a lot of the same openings. He plays a lot of the same endgames. And as we all do, right? And even if I asked you to write a sentence, we all have our favorite words that we go to. We all have our favorite structures. And so chess and poetry are kind of neatly overlapping for me there. That they're playing with the same sort of play and rules and constraints here. And that when we're creating a poem with the chess bard, what I really like about it is this collaborative ecosystem that it makes, that everything is interdependent and relying on each other, that both players, you can't play by yourself. You have to move, and this moves, and this moves, and this moves. And that the computer is not only kind of mediating this, but contributing to this as well. So I wanted to end then with this book, because I'm very excited about it. I literally got it on Tuesday, so you'll have to excuse me for being a little bit of a shill for myself. I do have copies of it for sale. Basically, it translates all of Marcel Duchamp's chess games into poems, collected works. It comes with an introduction from Jennifer Shahade. She's a 2-time U.S. women's chess champion. Wrote like a really, really lovely introduction. It also comes with Derek Boulia. He's a concrete poet, but he did some visual pieces for it as well as a way of getting into the sections. Going forward then, there's a group launch at the Garrison, that's Book Thug's launch, and then we're also going to be doing a solo launch performance with Jennifer Shahade. So in the past, her and I, she plays blindfolded, I play with my eyes wide open, and then the game is translated in real time. She destroys me. It would be funny if it didn't hurt so much. But we're thinking of some sort of other similar sort of performance. It might be like a simultaneous exhibition where she plays 5 people at once and then we get kind of 5 poems or something like that. So that's going to happen at the Arts and Letters Club on November 21st. If you do come up to buy a book from me tonight, they're $15. I 3D printed some Duchamp chess pieces, so you'll get a free Duchamp chess piece. This is one that he designed in Buenos Aires in, I think, 1918 or so. So I printed out little knights and little rooks that you can have if you come see me. Okay, thank you so much.